Cluster B personality disorders, the patients who suffer from these disorders, they have something called identity disturbance. Identity disturbance when there's no stable core, where there's no lifelong identifiable identity, where there's no constancy of objects, of values, of beliefs, of emotions, of affect, of cognitions, where everything is kaleidoscopic and mutually exclusive and contradictory. The same person can say one thing today and utterly contradict herself the next day. And this is called identity disturbance. Identity disturbance has a lot to do with dissociation, with severe disruptions in autobiographical memory, for example. But at any rate, patients who suffer from cluster B personality disorders have displayed dissociation, very strong and massive forms of dissociation, and consequently they don't have an identity. They don't have a core, and this is known as identity disturbance. And so these people are actually lifelong disappearing acts. They're disappearing acts pivoted on an empty schizoid core. There's nobody there. Cluster B personality disorders are not about presence or existence. They're about absence. The abuse of substances helps these patients to suspend their existence. That's why addiction is closely allied with cluster B patients. The dual diagnosis of addictive disorders and cluster B personality disorders is literally ubiquitous. Using substances allows these patients to suspend their existence, to not be themselves for a few hours. And this is especially true around other people in social and sexual contexts. Because cluster B patients are essentially nothing but deadened voids, they're dead inside, there's nobody there, it's empty. These patients feel alive, they feel existent only when they are not themselves, when they are inebriated, intoxicated, or drugged. Only then they feel that they exist. It's the irony. The irony is when they use substances to suspend themselves, only then they feel alive. When they act out recklessly, when they switch from one self-state to another one, to another self-state, for example, when the borderline switches to a secondary psychopath, when the narcissist switches to his grandiose false self, only then, when they are not themselves, when they had suspended their disturbed identity, when they had avoided the empty deep space black hole that constitutes them, only then these patients feel very much alive. But not being oneself, of course, is a fantasy. It's a fantasy defense. One can suspend oneself, one can stop being oneself, only in fantasy, never in reality. And fantasy is addictive, as I said earlier, so not being oneself becomes a habit, an addictive habit. Many of these patients forget how to be themselves. Being themselves feels so alien, so sad, so dull, so black and white or gray, so vaguely menacing that these patients avoid being themselves assiduously and for as long as they can. Their main preoccupation becomes, let's sustain the fantasy that I'm not me. Let's stop being me for a while. And gradually, incrementally, this overwhelming need to not be oneself, this overwhelming need to abuse substances in order to suspend oneself, these begin to impact all fields of life, one's job, one's career, one's relationships, and one's family included. Another problem is that when these patients are not themselves, when they're drunk, for example, predators of all types, sexual predators, emotional predators, psychopaths, they take advantage of these patients. They gain access to the patient's bodies, minds, and material possessions. They use these patients contemptuously, and then they discard these patients offhandedly. And these repeated humiliations, these rejections, this exploitation, they exacerbate the underlying conditions. They induce anxiety and depression. They push the patient inexorably to harm herself and to escalate even further her attempts to vanish. Further down the rabbit hole, further down the road to self-annihilation.